All right, another broadcast of Truth Be Told. I'm here with the one and only Captain Ron. I'm Tony Sweet, your hosts, and we have a great show for you guys today because this month is Women's Month, and we love our women. You know what I say. But we have a great guest because she is a professor, she's an author, she's a speaker, historian, and I love history. And we're going to find a little bit more about her book, which Oprah Winfrey Book Club has made one of the most talked about
must-read books of March.
March in 2018, of course. And so we are so excited to have her with us today. We have Bonnie J. Morris.
Hi, Bonnie.
Hi, Bonnie.
Hi. How is everybody out there? I am actually a native Angelino.
Oh, nice.
And grew up in Los Angeles until I was 10. So if there's anybody out there who went to Clover Avenue Elementary School, how you doing?
Well,
wait, you said y'all earlier, so I thought you were from somewhere else.
Yeah.
Yes, my family moved from L.A. to North Carolina,
and
North Carolina to D.C., and now I'm back in California in a beautiful Greek circle.
Nice. Well, welcome back to California, IA. But we're going to talk about your book. I'm holding it up, and I'm also showing a picture. It's called The Feminist Revolution. And for us, two guys here, we want to know a little bit more about the revolution. The revolution, I guess, that we're kind of talking about started in 1966. But, in just 2 years, the rights, the women's right to vote is coming up on its 100th anniversary. So, I mean,
yes.
Tony thinks they're going to repeal that. I disagree. I don't see it happening.
One hopes not.
Right.
It's all a beautiful series of waves, and there's a lot of dispute about whether the wave theory of feminism is the best one. But to make it simple, I teach women's history, and we tend to look in American history at the first wave of feminism, pretty much going from the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention and women meeting to overthrow slavery in the 1840s, all the way up to winning the vote in 1920.
Wow. And
yes, we're going to celebrate a 100-year anniversary of that pretty darn soon.
That's awesome.
Then we're very much aware that there's kind of a chill factor on women organizing, striking, and marching, because once women win the vote, we enter into kind of a Red Scare era in the 1920s with hostility to anybody who might be suspected communist. So if you were protesting against the government for any reason, fair wages, racism, it seemed to be proof that you were subversive. So instead, we have women finding personal freedoms through the flapper self-expression, daring to dance, drink, and mix with people of other races and sexualities in the Harlem Renaissance bars. Then we have women going out to work in World War II and the Rosie the Riveters showing the strength and ability to do industrial labor. And then we have in the United States a civil rights movement that inspired many white women to look at ways in which their rights are limited under the law. So the book that I've co-authored, and I had a partner in England writing the British version, is the second wave of American feminism, more or less beginning in the early 60s, and in the purpose of our book, going through the Reagan 80s. And in the 60s, the issues are very different. Women are voting. They're beginning to work outside the home in larger numbers than ever before, but they're treated as children, frankly, by everything from the banking system to universities to the way in which they're waged. And the effort to get more women into politics to change these laws is a big part of 60s feminism. Elect more women, get an equal rights amendment passed, overturn laws that were clearly oppressive and unfair. And then we start to get a more radical turn in the late 60s, which corresponds to men being more radical and women being frustrated that their issues aren't given much attention in groups that were ostensibly for all youth and people organizing. So women begin to focus on their own issues, which by then are very much about the right to birth control and abortion rights and freedom from sexual harassment and sexual violence. Some of that went in the direction of raising consciousness about violent depictions in pornography and media, and then other women simply addressed the lack of, normative representation of women in media. Women weren't bringing us the news, and the news was not about women. But women were certainly seen as sexual objects in film and TV. So part of the 70s was women making their own media, and that part of the revolution is my personal favorite and my expertise, where women begin to start their own presses, their own publishing houses, their own feminist bookstores to sell these publications. They begin to make their own music, and they are able to produce their own albums and stage concerts, some of which were for women only. Olivia Records was the first women-only, women-owned and operated recording company in the U.S. and trained many women to do sound and mixing. And much of this focus on creating women's culture was also about rediscovering women we had simply never been told about in school. Who were the great women composers and sculptors and writers and inventors, and how come their stories aren't in our school books? So women's studies followed and became a big part of changing the nature of education in our colleges and actually high schools and middle schools. And now we have Women's History Month, and even the Girl Scouts have a Women's History badge. So excited about that. And in the book, the problems that dog to the women's movement are not ignored. And we certainly look at racism in the movement, divisions between women, arguments about process. But the intention of the book is not to dwell on women as victims or women not getting along. Those are two of the worst stereotypes. It's really about all the actions that women participated in, and the illustrations tell the story. And we had great fun going through archives, museums, and our own personal collections for those posters and broadsides and pins you had on your backpack. I had plenty of magazine covers right in my own room that turned into illustrations. So the book is visually very arresting, and it's about some of the women who were arrested on the road to freedom.
This happens, it started, like you said, in the 60s. That's just before Tony and I. It seems like, I feel like those equal rights has been like my whole life. It seems like that was hundreds of years ago to me.
Right.
It's remarkable to hear how it's really not that long ago that women really didn't have the right?
Well, it's not. I mean, for somebody my age, and I'm 56, with the heart of a 28-year-old, it is not that long ago in terms of understanding that I was, quote, a gifted girl. But when I was an 11-year-old, Princeton University did not admit women.
Really?
See that kind of stuff. Isn't that amazing?
That kind of thing. The Ivy League schools were very reluctant to admit women on an equal basis with men. Princeton's argument to admit women students was they would make life more pleasant on campus for the male students. So initially, the Ivy League schools had a quota system where they admitted for every 2 women, 3 men. So women were not only in fewer numbers, they were competing against each other for coveted places. Law schools, grad schools, medical schools all jeered at women who wanted to, be applicants, and asked them, frankly, why should we give you a place? Aren't you just going to get married and get pregnant? All of that is illegal now, and thank you, Title IX. A law passed in 72. So let's just say that when I was, a middle school girl, the future that lay ahead for me was it didn't matter if, I had a high IQ. I couldn't go to any college I wanted. I couldn't go to any law school, any med school based on merit. It was very much based on gender.
Wow.
That's remarkable. And that's not that long ago, 72. That's incredible. It feels to me like... Those
are kind of the easiest issues to talk about in schools. part of the dilemma of teaching all of this is when you talk about women's history or women's studies, PTA boards get very anxious about school children talking about adult female sexuality and the body. And, it's hard to teach women's history without talking about that, but it's a little more neutral or age appropriate or whatever to talk to middle school girls about how would you feel if someone told you couldn't go to college because you were a girl. So that pretty recent part of the women's movement is very transferable to middle schools and high schools.
Well, I know just in the last year or so is the Me Too movement, and we've moved along a lot of
riding that wave she's talking about,
right? And it's really, I think, brought the movement back to the focus of what really needs to be done, because I think every movement, LGBT, African American, it kind of stalls, at certain points. I think this is really moving it forward. How do you feel about the Me Too movement, and what do you think is going to change now that women are really starting to speak out and not being afraid to speak out?
I think it's fantastic. I think the fact that it sort of originated with some of the problems of Hollywood producers and in addition to that, unfair wages. Of course, hardly everybody is a famous actress.
Right.
But if you are one, you have power at the microphone you can use for good. And not everybody wants to be a role model in that way when, they're trying to get a job, acting. But the fact that so many women have been forced to negotiate grasping hands and unwanted sexual attention, while they're trying to earn a living, portraying, a housemaid of the past. This is really important to peel back the curtain and show that a lot of decision-making and hiring includes women being needled with sexual come-ons that are just humiliating. And you never know until it happens how you're going to react or, what the appropriate response is. It's very easy to feel like it's your fault, that you must have said something or led the person on. So there's also a crisis in confidence for women who really have been abused and still don't believe they have a legitimate complaint. So these things are all very interconnected. Women are now realizing the same slogan from the early 60s, the personal is political. It's not just happening to me, it's happening to, every woman who worked with this producer or was on this film set. And because what happens in the entertainment industry is intended to be more visible to the public, those messages get out very quickly. And the hugest difference between now and 70s feminism is internet media, social media, make it possible to transmit a message globally in a second and to create a flash mob, if you wish, of feminists ready to rally. So a lot of the activism today does happen in cyberspace, but it also creates the possibility of organizing faster than ever before. This is making some men uncomfortable, and there were a lot of nervous jokes at the recent Academy Awards about men feeling that they're all on notice. It shouldn't be confusing that, unwanted attention is not a direction to go in if you're an employer. But it still seems to be a lesson we need to talk about with young men and so on. I think the same is true with bringing attention to the unresolved issues of, domestic violence and intimate partner violence. It's depressing. I've heard many women say that they've been activists for 40 or 50 years and they haven't been able to overcome the problem of rape and sexual violence in society. And globally, it's a huge issue. So at any given time, a lot of women are dealing with the baggage of having been abused or having been harassed in ways that have really pushed them out of their areas of work and talent, and it's bad for the economy, it's bad for everybody, but most of all, it's really an ongoing threat to the girls as well as adult women.
Right.
And the stereotype of 70s feminists is, women who were karate chopping men and who were hateful, and then it's not accurate. It's more accurate to say that it was one of the first times that women began to think about empowering themselves to not be afraid to go out at night by, learning some self-defense chops, but also to be politically aware of the pattern of, predators in society.
That stuff's horrible. But also, even at the Academy Awards, they were talking a lot about the inequality of pay. That alone is ridiculous, right?
Speaking as an underpaid adjunct professor, this is certainly close to my heart. I've never been paid equivalent to a tenured man, and I have had a teaching schedule that rivals anyone in the country for all my years in academia. Now, I love what I do, and I don't need much, but the point is, fair is fair.
Yeah, but so does the man. Maybe he likes his job, too.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, so part of this, I tell my students, okay, when you take the big picture, there was never any plan for women to be in the workforce in equal numbers to men. Salaries for a long time were determined around the idea that men were breadwinners and women were supplemental earners. Women were not supposed to earn more than men or as much as men. They were supposed to depend on the man's wages, and their status came from him getting a raise. That's a stock storyline in 60s Bewitched. It always baffled me. She would wiggle her nose and do everything in her magical power to get her husband a promotion rather than world peace or get herself employed. But anyway, the way that the work calendar is set up is based on, a husband working hard in the office and a wife at home taking care of children, household. That has not really changed. So wages, the lack of daycare, the expectation you put in long hours at a workplace, even if you have family at home, that is all based on a much older model. So it requires enormous adjustment from everybody. And we also have to adjust to understanding that women have always worked. Poor women, primarily women of color, women in factories and fields, pioneer women, farm wives, it's kind of the typical example when I'm grading students' papers. Someone will say, women only went out to work for the first time in the 1970s, and I do that kind of forehead slap. Isn't the question you're answering right before this about slavery? Have you forgotten about slave women? And I think the context for understanding women have been working all along.
Right.
Those women were not seen because they were not shown in TV shows. That was all pushed under the rug. The implication in a lot of sitcoms in the 50s and 60s, the early years of television, everybody's white, everybody's wealthy, there's no problem here. So talking about what women earn was shocking to a lot of people. They thought that was tacky. The ability of some women, yes, to become successful and CEOs and so forth, doesn't change the statistic that overall women earn less than men. And a lot of the predicament for women trying to advance professionally is they might have earned advanced degrees, but if they take time out to have a kid, they may not be able to return to work at the same level or rate of pay, and they have to make painful decisions about that. We don't have paternity leave as they do in Denmark and Sweden. So the burden is primarily on the woman who bears the child to come up with a solution for child care. what interests me is now that in the computer age, everyone can work from home. Will we have more house dads? But we haven't really seen that revolution yet.
Well, when do you think we're going to get there with the equality of pay? Is that 20 years away? Is that 100 years away? Is it never going to come?
Certainly more than 20 years away. It's way more. There's always an explanation. You know, in academia, if you're a couple and you both have PhDs, typically, you know, if one person in that couple is offered a tenured job, it's more likely to be the guy, and the woman follows him and works part-time where he is full-time, things like that. The other question is, what kinds of jobs are women isolated in? And they tend to be service jobs, which are low-paid, without benefits. They tend to be part-time. And, of course, there was a very famous trial, Sears versus EEOC in 1985, which my professor, Alice Kessler-Harris, worked on while I was in grad school. And that raised the question of, were, you know, women choosing to do part-time work because they wanted to be home when their kids came home from school, and therefore there was no pattern of discrimination. All of these things are interconnected. Do women choose lower waged work, or are they socialized to think their appropriate job is to be, you know, this kind of worker, which is in a, you know, career with low pay? The interesting thing is, even if you look at typical women's work, if you go to the highest professional end of that job, you'll usually find guys. So teaching is a very female job, but superintendents of schools tend to be men. Childcare is seen as a very traditional women's job. Child psychiatrist is often a man. Women make clothing, but we all know the names of designers, Oscar de la Renta, etc. Women do the cooking in the home, but top chef is usually a dude,
right?
And so on.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Did you have something?
Go ahead, I'll ask.
I was going to ask if you're seeing progress worldwide. Certainly in America, we're seeing a lot of progress in a lot of areas. What about countries like Saudi Arabia or some of these countries that are way behind us?
Women had to riot to drive.
Yeah,
right.
Well, it's hard to compare. Many countries are way ahead of the United States. They have much better health care, paternity leave, you know, wages. Many of the Scandinavian countries are way ahead of the United States. There's, you know, arguments that, well, they're more homogeneous, and the U.S. is much more of a melting pot of immigrants with varying needs.
You have a lot more car accidents, though, right, Tony?
Right.
Yeah. I would say that the big challenge in the world is understanding women's rights locally in context. There was a very famous women's world conference in Nairobi in the mid-'80s. There had been several UN women's world conferences, the first one in Mexico City, then Copenhagen, then Nairobi, then Beijing. And the one in Kenya, the American women were sitting around talking about, you know, the freedom of their own sexuality, and many of the women from rural Kenya were sitting in a circle asking each other, where do you get clean water? So all politics is local, and for many women of the world, it's about staying alive, feeding their kids, getting enough to eat so they can breastfeed their babies, having security in civil war and strife. The big challenge for many women is rape as a war crime, or as ethnic warfare, or as retribution. Crimes of honor are distinctive in many parts of the world compared to some of the ways women are shamed in the United States. But in terms of the good news, it is remarkable that all countries now send women to the Olympics, including Saudi Arabia. Education for women is a priority in terms of funding and UN development and microloans to women. Particularly in India, there is much more public awareness about harassment, crimes against women, and there is globally a lot of recognition that if you make loans to women's businesses, the money will go to the community and to children, and there isn't the risk, let's say, in some instances where a group of men might be tempted to drink and gamble and womanize with extra money. For a lot of women, the biggest problem is they do double duty of field work, childcare, and often a wage job too. They don't have extra time to go to school, and regrettably, where night school is offered, in many countries, it's seen as a problem of modesty and propriety for a woman who is married to go out at night, particularly if her teachers are other men she's not related to. So it's complicated. Online education is not a solution to the going out in public problem if you can't afford a computer or you aren't already literate. So the advantages of current technology come with their own intriguing baggage, but the interesting thing is the problems for women in other countries are sometimes thrown in the face of American feminists. It used to be, you don't like it here, go live in Moscow. And now it's, you don't like it here, go live in Afghanistan. And the implication is, hey, women, the feminist revolution in America is complete. You have it better than elsewhere. So stop whining. That ignores the many problems that are still in our society, but it also makes women elsewhere simply appear to be victims who are not engaged in their own political organizing. And of course they are. There are all kinds of great women's organizations, and even, in a place like Afghanistan, there's more representation of women in government there than here.
That's remarkable. I would have bet you $1,000 is the other way. That's incredible.
Right. Because there's a designation to have so many women representing, so many tribes and so forth.
Unbelievable.
Well,
we did not have a women's bathroom in the Senate building until 1992.
Wow,
after
that's crazy.
How current that
were
is.
Elected.
That's remarkable.
Crazy, yeah. Well, speaking a little bit of politics, as we all know, just a few years ago when Hillary Clinton ran for president, she was the closest any woman has ever come to becoming president. And, there was a big backlash, and we've never seen a campaign like this before. Do you feel that the Hillary Clinton was a flawed candidate, or do you think the backlash because she was a woman was one of the reasons that they came very hard for her?
Wow. Well, I don't think any candidate is perfect. I think definitely the backlash, was, fear of having a woman tell men what to do. That you could go in many directions psychologically, but historically that you can see that in, the suffrage movement. Men in power were convinced that if, women had the vote, they would turn the whole country into a big maternity ward with treating men like children, shutting down bars and brothels, and having a nanny state. And I think that there are a lot of people who still believe that would be true, and they pin whatever they project their fantasies onto a woman candidate. For example, many people will joke vulgarly that you can't have a woman in the White House because, if she gets her period and she's stressed, she'll set off World War III. Well, the average age of a woman who runs for office is past menopause, so that has never been a factor of if a woman is in leadership. She would be affected by her hormones. The other thing is you don't have most of the students that I've worked with aware of women who have been leaders in American history. Very few of my students are aware that Shirley Chisholm, an African-American woman, ran for president in 1972. Yeah. They don't know Patsy Mink, the first Asian-American woman elected to Congress, and how much of a role she played in getting Title IX law and women's sports supported. And the question that many of my students are confused by is, what American state was once ruled by a queen? And of course, that's Hawaii, Queen Liliuokalani. So we have had female monarchs in what is now the United States before. And the strange thing is you look around the world and there are queens and women prime ministers, from, Iceland, to New Zealand, wherever.
Germany,
lack of support for a woman in the United States, I think, comes from, many factors in our history, in part because we rejected monarchy in the beginning, but also definitely a disregard for older women in particular, and a fear of a well-spoken woman. We're also, regrettably, a very anti-intellectual country, and people have mocked President Obama's scholarly style. I loved it personally.
What do you mean a fear, though? What do you mean a fear?
Time to be a smart person right now, but a smart woman is threatening for reasons of history, politics, culture, and misogyny.
Why do you think that people fear that?
I don't know. Academically, I could go in different directions. Everyone who is fortunate to grow up in a home with a mother figure is supposed to separate from her at some point. And so we are oriented toward not having a mother figure telling us what to do later in life. And for that reason, some, not all people, react negatively to a female boss, a female head of state, a female minister. They turn to the mother figure who makes rules and also dispenses comfort in the home. The easiest place to see this principle operating is in TV news journalism, where for a long time the rule was for bad news, America wanted a father figure, and they had Walter Cronkite telling everyone that John F. Kennedy had been shot. Yeah. Women were not supposed to bring bad news or cover what was called hard news. And in addition, women who were hired as news anchors had to look young and pleasing and pretty in certain ways. So you take that in a media culture and you apply it to the presidency. And, then there are people who are convinced that unless a woman has, military background or whatever, for her to make decisions about armaments and policy and invasions is challenging. Now, we've had plenty of guys, who also did not serve and so forth. But that seems to be a suspicion that women should be unwilling to take a life, and that's something that's sometimes asked of the commander-in-chief.
Right.
But
so, go on, sorry.
I was going to say, Bonnie, in the media stuff you're talking about, look at now. We had Megyn Kelly just last week speak to Putin.
I know.
I mean, that's pretty remarkable, right?
Yeah, you've had women who have been ambassadors, Secretary of State. There's no question that women can do the job. It would seem that there are people who just recoil from watching a woman be good at her job. I think that there's also that same phenomenon that we saw in World War II. Everyone understood that in an emergency, women were certainly qualified to do men's jobs, and women went into the military, the workforce, and they also played professional baseball. Then the minute the war was over, women were put out of all those new opportunities. And so part of what's a pattern in American history is if it was an emergency, we know we can rely on you, but we don't want to rely on you. We would rather you be available to look refreshing and beautiful and a source of comfort. And that's just got to go.
Right.
Because so many women have been denied the development of their potential, and it's cost the nation. I certainly remember the cultural stereotype that it was cute if a girl hated math and was bad at science. That was somehow adorable. Well, that is not funny or adorable now. We need everybody to, focus on knowledge. So we were having allowed girls to catch up. They have raced right across that finish line. And getting back to the book, what the book, The Feminist Revolution, addresses is what were the steps that had to be taken to go from no girls allowed to women running for president. And it was a lot of public agitation and being seen as, quote, unladylike, and naming violence that everybody was aware of but didn't like to have named, and communicating without the benefit of Facebook. Rallies were our Facebook. Women's music festivals were our Facebook. And women had to become more comfortable talking about their own bodies, asking their own doctors questions, becoming informed, educating each other, and learning to see each other as allies.
Well, we have just a few minutes left, and I want everybody to go and pick up this book, The Feminist Revolution, The Struggles for Women's Liberation. Because I'm a big history buff, and I think everybody should know their history. If they're from Africa or European, I think everybody should know where they come from.
We don't realize what they went through to get here.
No, we don't.
We think they're just here. It was a battle.
And so we appreciate people like you because you're putting this book together.
Well, I had a wonderful time doing it. I'm really there's nothing I like better than writing, except talking about writing with people who appreciate writing. And my experience in a contemporary culture, which is much more, online than paper, or on screen than paper. Students in particular have more tools than ever before to do their own history projects. They can interview their parents and grandparents right on their iPhone or whatever. Everybody's a little archivist. You can make a film at a rally and post it online and be your own little mini journalist. So what I try to do is encourage, younger people, like, hey, you want to know what it was like to be, a woman in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, get out a tape recorder at your next family gathering and ask.
Right.
And people will be delighted to be asked, and then you'll preserve not just family history, but national history.
Agreed. Before we get out of here, what did you learn? Because you've been, studying this and speaking about this for a long time. What did you learn from this book, putting it together?
Putting it together, wow. Well, I learned that no matter what, you have to leave something out. So we're already thinking about a volume 2.
Oh.
There's, you have to edit, it's difficult to make choices about what to emphasize, but what we ended up doing was obviously trying to foreground big turning points, big events, big rallies that struck a chord in so many women, black and white, rich and poor. And it's important to emphasize what brought women together and not simply dwell on what's pulling them apart. And the images of women of all different backgrounds marching together with linked arms is a statement that we really need in this time.
And in looking back since the early 1960s till now, and then looking forward, who are a few people from the past 40-some years, maybe 50 years, that you feel that have made the huge impact on us today and our future, and then some of the women now that are going to make an impact on our future?
Wow, what a great question. Well, of course, you're covering my entire lifetime. I was hugely inspired by Billie Jean King, Shirley Chisholm. I was very much aware of, the work of women of color organizing, Dolores Huerta, the farm workers movement, definitely the women who helped organize collecting the stories of Japanese American women who were interned in World War II.
Wow. Yeah.
Gerda Lerner, who really worked to get women's history a field that's now a normative part of colleges and universities. I was very inspired by the lesbian rights movement. Definitely the writings of women like Rita Mae Brown and Carla Jay.
Right.
Lillian Faderman, even now a great mentor, role model, and friend of mine who more or less invented the field of doing research on lesbians in history and how women advocated for their rights. By the time I got to college, I was also really impressed by the many years of journalism that came from Ms. Magazine and what it took to keep that going. A factor in my experiences in college, the women's music movement. I've mentioned Olivia Records, the Michigan Women's Music Festival, produced by Lisa Vogel, and I was certainly inspired in grad school by all of the women who kept women's health clinics open and provided reproductive services, Planned Parenthood, a thankless job for the many women experiencing backlash. Today, I think the young women who started Black Lives Matter have to be remembered as young women who started Black Lives Matter, and other women organizers now, obviously Emma Gonzalez in Florida in the wake of a tragedy, organizing young people to march against gun violence in Washington, D.C. on March 24th. I'll be there.
Nice.
And many of the, young women who are advocating for wages in the workplace, but also the Women's World Cup soccer team, all the women athletes, certainly my own student, Alana Myers-Taylor, just brought home an Olympic medal, and she started in my women's sports history class at George Washington University.
Nice.
So
wow.
I've been
That's great.
honored to work with a whole lot of dynamic students, and I'd like to point out that I've also had terrific young men taking women's studies, and even had the Crown Prince of Jordan taking my Intro to Women's Studies class at Georgetown. So young men who will be world leaders one day are also invested in applying justice to women and women's history, and that's a terrific sign.
Well, the inspiration that you've put into this book, and I know it's going to flow over into many young women, hopefully to lead the way to, our next president and leaders in the community.
Yeah.
So I know, we're excited about that, but we're excited that you came on the show and shared this with us, and we really appreciate you. And where can people go find the book? I know pretty much anywhere, but we want to hear it from you.
You can order it through Random House. It is Smithsonian Press. Just came out this week. The book is The Feminist Revolution, The Struggle for Women's Liberation. And you can go online also to my website, www.bonniejmorris.com. And I'm going to be signing autographs at the Smithsonian on Sunday, March 25th, Palm Sunday. So I'll be in Washington for the rally, and then the next day at the bookshop. And I'm sure I'll get to L.A. at some point.
Well,
come back to the old neighborhood and sign books. I would love to.
Yeah, stop in and see us, and we'd love to have you.
Already on Oprah's must-read list. How about that?
Oprah's must-read. Come on, you can't get any better than that. So.
I know. My mind is just spinning. That was a tremendous honor.
It's wonderful.
It was thrilling to see my name in Oprah magazine. All I want now is to appear on Ellen.
There you
go.
go.
Everything will be complete in my world as a
listen. If
smiling,
Oprah approves it,
feminist scholar.
Yeah, if you listen, if Oprah gives you the thumbs up, you get on Ellen, and you've been on Truth Be Told. Yeah. I mean, what you got it.
I know. What else could I ask?
That's right.
All right, go get the book, The Feminist Revolution, The Struggle
you.
of Women's Liberation. And this is Bonnie J. Morris. Please go to her website, bonniejmorris.com. Thank you guys for joining us here on Truth Be Told. Once again, we love to hear from you. I know Captain Ron and we appreciate every single one of you for listening and commenting.
Subscribe to our YouTube channel.
And listen to us on iHeartRadio. Radio. Now we're on Spotify, and download our app.
That's even better.
On iTunes, and you can listen to all of our podcasts there. So thank you very much. Until next week, we'll see you then. Bye.